The wind on LX-781 had no voice. It pressed against Cade's helmet with a sound like sand across old bone, steady and indifferent. He walked away from his battered landing skiff, grav boots sinking into gray powder that had not felt impact in 10,000 years. The survey scanner had flagged nothing worth a corporate claim: trace metals, a dead core, atmospheric ghosts too faint to breathe. But Cade had learned to read the spaces between data, a static whisper in the low-band spectrum, a thermal echo that pulsed exactly once every 31 hours. Something buried, something still warm. He followed the signal across a ridge that crumbled under his gloves, and then he stopped. The dune ahead was a lie. Beneath the wind-sculpted gray, an angle of metal thrust upward, no, not upward. The metal was the horizon. The ridge Cade stood on was not a ridge. It was the outer casing of a primary thrust cowling. He turned slowly, boots scraping, and the shape resolved as his mind finally permitted it. A ship buried so deep the planet had grown a crust over its spine. The visible portion alone stretched 3 kilometers along the bow flare, and the rest vanished beneath the world's skin like a monster sleeping under a sheet of ash. Cade HUD through distance markers that kept recalculating. Error. Recalibrate. Error. The vessel was not built to any scale human shipwrights used. It was older than the Dominion charters, older than the trade tongues, older than the species that now called the galaxy civilized. He climbed, hand over hand along plating that shed centuries of dust. The metal drank light. No pitting, no corrosion. A hull designed to outlive suns. Cade found a seam, a maintenance hatch, or maybe a wound, and spent 3 hours cutting through with a plasma saw that nearly melted before the lock gave way. Darkness inside, air that had not moved since the last ice age on Earth. He dropped a flare. It fell for a very long time before the glow caught geometry, hallways taller than hangar bays, support columns like petrified forest trunks, gravity still functioning at 83% human standard. Something in the depth of the ship hummed, not a system starting, recognition. The hum tuned itself to the frequency of Cade's own suit reactor, a greeting or a test. He should have run. He should have called in the find, sold the coordinates for 10 lifetimes of credit, and vanished into the core worlds. Instead, Cade walked toward the hum, because he had spent his whole life hearing people say that humans were too loud, too reckless, too small to matter on the galactic stage. And here was a dead god's chariot, and it was humming his song. The bridge doors opened before he touched them. A holograph bloomed, fractured, starved of power, but speaking in a language that translated in jagged bursts. Cade caught one clear word before the image collapsed: vow. The deck trembled. Lights that had been cold for 10 millennia flickered amber, then gold, then steady white. The ship was not dead. It had been listening, and now it had a heartbeat again. Part 2. The corridor stretched far enough that Cade felt vertigo despite the steady gravity. Every surface was smooth alloy marked with symbols that seemed to rearrange when he looked away. The ship was not trying to frighten him. It was trying to understand him. He reached the bridge after what his suit clock insisted was an hour. The space was circular, ringed with dead consoles and a single chair built for something with too many limbs. In the center, a crystalline lens the size of a shuttlecraft hung dark. Cade approached the command interface, a curved slab of what looked like obsidian but responded to his touch with warmth. The moment his bare fingers met the surface, the ship entered him. Not an attack, a merging. Data streamed through his optic nerve, too fast for pain. He saw the ship's name, Iron Vow. He saw its builders, tall, quiet beings who called themselves the Keleth, who had forged this vessel to protect a federation of 30 species. He saw the enemy that came after, a plague, not a fleet, something that rewrote biology into screaming slurry. The Keleth burned their own worlds to stop it, and the Iron Vow was scuttled here so the plague could never use it. The final log played. A captain whose voice sounded like wind through hollow stone stood on this bridge and spoke words that the translator rendered with brutal simplicity. "We failed the living. Let the ship wait for someone who will not fail." The hologram faded. Cade stood alone, breathing hard, sweat cooling on his neck. The ship had chosen him because he was the first life form to set foot aboard in 10,000 years. The Iron Vow's systems had enough autonomy to recognize purpose. It had scanned Cade's neural architecture during the merge and found something the Keleth would have respected: a stubborn refusal to accept the odds. He didn't kneel. That would have been theater. Instead, he placed his palm flat on the interface and said, "You want a captain. I'm the only applicant." The ship answered. Gravity shifted. The giant lens ignited with a pale violet glow that illuminated the entire bridge. Status reports scrolled across walls, translating into Anglo script as they went. Weapons, offline but intact. Engines, cold start capable. Hull integrity, 94%. Crew complement, 1. Cade grinned, but it wasn't predatory. It was the expression of a man who had just been handed a thunderstorm and told to aim it. Then a proximity alert screamed. The tactical display shimmered, showing 3 vessels dropping out of FTL at the edge of the system. Dominion patrol cutters, ugly, angular ships built by an empire that had spent the last century annexing species that couldn't fight back. Their design was brutalist, effective, and they were burning straight for the Iron Vow. A voice crackled across the ship's comm array, speaking Dominion Standard with a slaver's contempt. "Unidentified vessel, you are in restricted space. Power down and prepare for boarding. Resistance will result in immediate obliteration." Cade looked around the bridge, at systems he barely understood, at a weapon that hadn't fired in an age. The patrol cutters outnumbered him, outgunned him in any rational assessment. He touched the comm. "This is the Iron Vow. You have exactly 1 chance to turn around." The Dominion captain laughed. "1 ship, barely powered." "1 ship," Cade said, "and I'm still learning the controls. That makes me more dangerous, not less." He cut the channel and began frantically scrolling through the defense protocols. The ship had been asleep, but it remembered how to bite. Part 3. The Dominion patrol did not turn around. They never did. The Empire had spent so long crushing isolated colonies and broken species that the concept of serious resistance had calcified into myth. 3 cutters spread into a pincer formation, weapons hot. Broadcasting, a jamming screech, designed to paralyze civilian systems. The Iron Vow ignored the jamming. Its communication architecture predated Dominion technology by eons, and the Keleth had built their warships to laugh at electronic warfare. Cade found the point defense grid 3 layers deep in the menu, activated it with a mental command that startled him, and watched the ship respond. The dorsal plating split open. 200 flak emplacements rose from their housings like the spines of a waking beast. They did not fire projectiles. They projected grav shears, slicing spacetime into ribbons the width of a molecule. The lead cutter flew directly into a shear field and ceased to exist in a burst of silent white light. The other 2 cutters tried to break off. Their pilots were not fools. They recognized old horror when it reared up. One managed a half-turn before a shear caught its engine section. The third ran, streaking for the FTL threshold. Cade let it go. He needed a witness. He slumped into the alien chair, chest heaving. The ship's power core had dipped to 70% after that burst. He had a lot to learn, but the point had been made, and the galaxy would soon hear a story that did not align with Dominion propaganda. The captain's log chambers were intact. Cade spent the next 2 cycles absorbing what the Keleth had left behind: schematics, weapon paths, the ship's true name, Vow of Iron resolve, and its original mission, to be the shield behind which refugee fleets could flee. The Keleth had not been warriors by nature. They had been architects of safety, and they had failed not because their ship was weak, but because the plague was designed to bypass every defense. Cade understood now. The Iron Vow was not just a battleship. It was a mobile fortress, a city-sized sanctuary with fabrication bays, medical suites that could treat 100 species, and an FTL drive that could jump farther than any modern vessel. It was a lifeline that had arrived too late for its builders. He stood on the bridge, staring at the star chart that filled the lens. The Dominion occupied a third of the mapped arm. Beyond their border, dozens of protectorate species lived under occupation, stripped of technology, their populations managed like livestock. Cade had seen the reports. Everyone had. And most people looked away because the Dominion's fleet was too strong. The Iron Vow hummed beneath his feet. It felt like a question. "Yeah," Cade said to the ship, "we're not looking away." He plotted a course for the nearest free port, a grimy station called Harrow's Gate where questions were cheap and loyalty was cheaper. He needed a crew. He needed supplies. And he needed the Dominion to understand that a dead Guardian had found a living pilot with a very human refusal to stop. The translation matrix finished compiling an outgoing broadcast. Cade recorded a message, short and unpolished. "To any being who can hear this, my name is Cade. I am human. I am aboard a vessel called the Iron Vow. If you are running, if you are hunted, if the Dominion has taken everything from you, find me. I'll be the one making them bleed." He sent it on a wideband pulse that would ripple across the sector for weeks. Then he engaged the FTL, and the dead planet LX-781 shrank behind him, its gray dunes once again empty. The Dominion High Command received the patrol's survivor report 6 hours later. The admiral who read it did not believe the footage until 3 separate analysts confirmed it was unaltered. He stared at the silhouette of the Iron Vow and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Uncertainty. Part 4. Harrow's Gate orbited a brown dwarf in a system nobody wanted. The station was a tangle of retrofitted freighters and prefab habs, held together by desperation and ducted atmo. When the Iron Vow dropped out of FTL 40,000 kilometers off the docking ring, traffic control suffered a collective panic attack. Cade brought the ship in slow, broadcasting a friend or foe code he'd manufactured from salvaged templates. The station's guns tracked him but did not fire. Nobody at Harrow's Gate fired on anything big enough to blot out the starfield. He docked, or rather, the Iron Vow extended a boarding tube that mated with the station's largest umbilical like a fist closing around a twig. Cade walked into the station's main concourse wearing a reinforced vac suit and carrying nothing but a data slate. The bounty was already live. The Dominion had placed 500,000 sovereigns on his head, alive for interrogation. Cade saw the postings flickering on every public terminal. He also saw the faces of the bounty hunters who recognized him and weighed that number against the ship moored outside. Nobody moved. A Rilith dockworker with scarred mandibles approached. Her species had been conquered by the Dominion 60 years ago. She looked at Cade, at the bounty, at the distant glow of the Iron Vows, running lights visible through the viewport. "You the one who scrapped a patrol squadron?" "One ship," Cade said. "They didn't listen." The Rilith's mandibles twitched. "My Nest brother was on a colony they glassed. If you're hunting Dominion, I can find you people who'll work for nothing except a chance to shoot back." Within 12 hours, Cade had a crew. Not many, 37 souls, most of them with more scars than training. Engineers who'd kept dying freighters running. A Vex navigator whose species had been rendered nearly extinct by Dominion bioweapons. A weapons tech who'd spent a decade building illegal munitions for anyone who'd pay. They were not soldiers. They were survivors, and they poured into the Iron Vow like water into cracked earth. The ship accepted them. Its internal bioscanners registered each new life form and adjusted temperature, gravity, atmo mix. The Keleth had designed the vessel to carry refugees. Now it carried a crew born from the same ashes. Cade stood on the bridge with his new senior staff. The tactical display showed Dominion fleet movements, convoys, supply lines, patrol rotations. Cade tapped a location in the Tarvith sector. Supply depot, heavily guarded, but they run their logistics through this station. We hit it, we cripple 3 border fleets for a month. More importantly, we find out what's inside. The Dominion's been moving sealed cargo through there for years. No trade manifests. No explanation. The Vex navigator Nis tilted her elongated skull. You want to provoke them. I want to expose them, Cade said. The Dominion runs on fear. If we crack open their secrets, the fear flips. We become the nightmare they told their kids about. The crew did not cheer. They were not that kind of crew. But they went to their stations without argument, and the Iron Vow turned toward the Tarvith sector with the quiet finality of a blade being drawn. 3 days later, they emerged from FTL on the edge of the supply depot's sensor net. 12 Dominion cruisers ringed the station, automated gun platforms, minefields. Cade looked at the odds. Then he looked at the weapon systems the Keleth had buried in the ship's deepest vaults, systems he hadn't dared activate until now. He keyed the arming sequence. The Iron Vow's spine rippled with violet fire. Let's see what they've been hiding, he said, and let's make sure everyone sees it with us. Part 5. The assault on the Tarvith depot lasted 14 minutes. To the Dominion defenders, it felt like a century compressed into a heartbeat. The Iron Vow did not decloak because the Keleth had never bothered with cloaking. They had built something far more terrifying, a phase-shunt field that shifted the ship microseconds out of sync with local spacetime. Torpedoes passed through its hull. Turbolacers bent around its mass like light around a black hole. The ship was not invisible. It was not quite there, a ghost that could choose when to be solid. Cade triggered the phase collapse the moment the Iron Vow intersected the station's defense grid. The ship snapped fully into reality with a grav shockwave that shattered the minefields and sent 2 cruisers tumbling out of formation. Then the point defense grid spoke. Flak shears carved through the Dominion line like a scythe through dry wheat. The cruisers' shields were optimized for modern weapons. Against grav-shear technology, they offered as much protection as paper against a blowtorch. 3 ships died in the first 90 seconds. 4 more tried to retreat. The Iron Vow's main cannon, a lance the Keleth had designed to crack continental plates, fired once. The shot passed through the lead cruiser, through the station's outer hull, and exited the far side without slowing down. The survivors surrendered. Cade led the boarding team himself. What they found inside the sealed cargo bays stripped the crew silent. Biological storage, millions of cryo-encased neural templates, brain scans of conquered species, ripped from living subjects and frozen for use in Dominion combat simulators. The Empire was building training AIs out of butchered minds. The scanned individuals were dead. Their memories, their personalities, their very selves had been harvested and caged, used to teach Dominion pilots how to kill their own kind more efficiently. Cade stood in a vault that held the template of a species called the Ixthera, a gentle, amphibious people who had welcomed Dominion explorers with open harbors. 90,000 templates, every Ixthera who had ever lived. Nis's voice came over the comm, cracked with something that was not static. Captain, there are children's patterns here. Cade closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Then he opened them and broadcast to every system in the sector. He showed the galaxy what he had found. Raw footage, unedited, the vaults, the cryo cases labeled like inventory, the Dominion's own internal memos recovered from the station's data core discussing optimal harvesting techniques. The broadcast ended with Cade facing the camera. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had run out of shock and found only a deep, cold resolve on the other side. I am one human, he said. On one ship. This is what I found in a single depot. The Dominion has 17 more like it. I intend to visit everyone. Anyone who wants to help is welcome. Anyone who stands in the way gets introduced to my guns. The Dominion High Command went to maximum alert. 40 warships were rerouted to the Tarvith region. The Emperor himself, a bloated creature named Hethrex who had not been seen in public for 30 years, issued a statement calling Cade a terrorist, a destabilizer, a criminal. But across 100 occupied systems, the message spread in whispers: a human, a dead ship, and a promise written in fire. The Iron Vow had found its purpose again, and this time it would not fail the living. Part 6. The Dominion threw everything at him. 40 ships became 60. 60 became a full armada, led by the flagship Scepter of Dominion, a dreadnought that had never known defeat. They cornered the Iron Vow in the Ring of Knives, an asteroid field so dense that navigation was considered suicide. Cade had chosen the field deliberately. He had spent weeks learning the Iron Vow's systems, and he had found a protocol the Keleth had locked away, a failsafe that had never been tested. The ship could phase not just itself, but a bubble of space around it, folding local geometry in a way that turned physical laws into suggestions. The Keleth had feared the weapon. They had called it the Devourer's Gambit and sealed it behind ethical safeguards. Cade broke the safeguards. The Armada closed in. Scepter of Dominion broadcast an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. Cade replied with a single word: remember. He activated the Gambit. The Iron Vow's core screamed into a frequency that shattered 3 of the ship's own secondary reactors. The phase bubble expanded at light speed, catching the Dominion fleet in a zone where distance became meaningless. For 2.3 seconds, every ship in the Armada existed in the same cubic meter of space. Then reality reasserted itself. Matter cannot overlap. The fleet did not explode. It imploded, compressed into a sphere of hyperdense wreckage the size of a shuttlecraft. The Scepter of Dominion, pride of the Empire, became a marble. The Iron Vow limped out of the Ring of Knives on backup power, trailing coolant and sparks. Cade's hands were shaking. He had burned out half the ship's systems. The Gambit had nearly killed them all. But behind him, the Dominion's greatest concentration of naval power was a lump of gravitationally collapsed metal. The galaxy watched the sensor recordings. They watched a human do the impossible, and they began to believe. Refugee ships started arriving at the Iron Vow's rally point, an unclaimed system Cade named Anchorhold. First dozens, then hundreds. Broken fleets from 17 species. Civilian transports packed with families who had seen the broadcast and decided that if a human could fight, so could they. Cade turned the Iron Vow's fabrication bays toward building, not destroying. The ship that was designed to be a shield became exactly that, a mobile fortress ring expanding into an armada of its own. Not a fleet of conquest, a fleet of protection. The Dominion reeled. Their supply lines were shattered. Their emperor faced open revolt from military commanders who had never before questioned orders. And in the halls of the Galactic Assembly, ambassadors who had once voted to appease the Dominion began drafting resolutions of support. Cade stood on the bridge, watching the first new ship, a corvette built from the Iron Vow's designs, slide out of the construction bay. Nis stood beside him, her scars pale in the starlight. "Is this victory?" she asked. Cade shook his head. "No, this is just the beginning." "Of what?" He looked at the growing fleet, at the faces appearing on the comm channels, at a galaxy that had nearly forgotten what hope felt like. Of the galaxy learning it doesn't have to be afraid anymore. Part 7. The Dominion did not fall quietly. Hethrex, cornered and desperate, activated a contingency that had been buried since the Empire's founding. A biogenic weapon derived from the same plague that had killed the Keleth. Modified, controllable, a genocide with a kill switch. Cade learned of the weapon when a Dominion defector crashed a stolen shuttle into Anchorhold's outer perimeter, screaming about the final sanction. The defector, an intelligence officer named Vash, delivered a data core that made Cade's blood still. The Dominion had seeded the weapon on 23 Protectorate worlds. A single activation command would release it simultaneously. 50 billion beings would die in less than a cycle. Hethrex gave Cade an ultimatum of his own. Surrender the Iron Vow and stand trial for crimes against the Empire, or watch those worlds burn. Cade did not debate. He did not convene a council. He gave Nis command of the defensive fleet, boarded the Iron Vow alone, and jumped directly into the Dominion core system. The Imperial Palace was a moon-sized fortress ringed by 10,000 gun batteries and a personal guard fleet. The Iron Vow's remaining systems were still damaged from the Gambit. It had point defense and half an FTL drive. It did not have a plan. What it had was Cade. He broadcast on every frequency, including the civilian bands. "Hethrex, I'm here, you want the ship, come take it." The Dominion sprang its final trap. The guard fleet locked the Iron Vow in a gravity net that even the phase shunt couldn't slip. Boarding pods launched. Hundreds of Dominion Marines cut through the hull. Cade was not on the bridge. He was in the core chamber, standing before the heart of the Iron Vow, a sphere of contained singularity the Keleth had used to power the Gambit. The safeties were already broken. The only thing left was to choose how the story ended. He keyed the intercom one last time. "Hethrex, you built an empire on the bones of species you thought were weaker. You were wrong about them, and you're wrong about me." He triggered the singularity release. Not the Gambit, something simpler. A self-destruct the Keleth had designed as a final mercy, a way to prevent the plague from ever claiming the ship. The Iron Vow began to collapse inward, dragging space with it. The Dominion Guard fleet scrambled to escape the gravity well. The Marines aboard the ship felt their atoms stretch. And then the singularity stopped. Cade had not set a full detonation. He had set a countdown with a dead man switch linked to his own vitals. If his heart stopped, the ship would go. If he chose to stop the countdown, it would halt. But the countdown itself was enough to terrify the Dominion into full retreat. He stood in the core chamber, watching the swirling maw of a collapsed star, and broadcast one final message. "I am holding the trigger. If I die, this system becomes a black hole. You have 1 hour to deactivate the sanction, release every occupied world, and sign an unconditional armistice, or we all find out what comes after." It was insane. It was reckless. It was the most human thing imaginable, one person choosing to stand in the path of annihilation and demanding the universe blink first. Hethrex raged. His generals calculated. And the math was simple. They could kill Cade, but the Iron Vow's collapse would take the Imperial core, the Emperor, and the Empire's entire command structure with it. The Dominion had spent centuries conquering because they feared death. They would not choose it now. The armistice was signed. The sanction was dismantled. And when Cade finally released the dead man switch and stumbled out of the core chamber, he found the boarding Marines had dropped their weapons. They were not saluting. They were kneeling. Not to him, to the ship that had refused to die, and to the species that had refused to let it. Part 8. The war ended with ink and broadcast signals rather than gunfire. Occupation forces withdrew from 17 systems in the first month. Captive species took their first free breaths in generations. The Dominion's ruling council, stripped of Hethrex, who had been quietly removed by his own admirals, sued for terms they would never have offered a conventional power. Cade sat in the anchor system that now bore the name Keleth's Rest, watching construction drones weave the skeleton of a permanent station. The Iron Vow floated at the center, still scarred, still tired, but alive. It would never fight again. The Singularity core was permanently depleted, the Gambit locked away beyond recovery. The ship was a museum now, a monument, and a home. Nis stood beside him holding a report. "The Assembly wants to give you a title, Galactic Protector, First Shield, several dozen others. Some of them are very embarrassing. Cade snorted. Tell them I'm a salvager, that's all I ever was. A salvager who ended the Dominion. A salvager who found a ship. He turned to look at the iron vow, its hull catching the light of a young star. The Keleth built it to be a shield. I just aimed it. The truth was both simpler and larger than the legend. The galaxy had learned something about humanity in the crucible of those years. Not that humans were unstoppable predators, but that they were stubborn in a way that rewrote equations. A human, given a dead ship and a righteous cause, did not calculate odds. They built a road where no road existed and walked it until the universe gave way. The Anchor-Hold Accord was signed by 73 species. It established a mutual defense pact, a ban on biogenic weapons, and an agreement to share the Keleth technology that Cade had unlocked. The Iron Vow's blueprints were distributed freely. Nobody would ever again face extinction alone. Cade made one final broadcast, not a speech, an invitation. To anyone who's lost, who's running, who's hiding, there's a place. It's not perfect, it's not finished, but it's safe. And it will always be safe as long as people are willing to stand up and say no more. That's what the Iron Vow meant. That's what it still means. You don't need to be a hero, you just need to show up. He cut the channel before his voice could crack. Nis pretended not to notice. The years that followed were not peaceful in the way stories pretend peace works. There were skirmishes, diplomatic crises, new threats lurking in unexplored voids. But the Accord held, the shield held, and the Iron Vow became a pilgrimage site, a place where beings of every shape came to touch the hull and remember what one life could do. Cade grew old aboard that ship. Not as captain, he had passed that role to a young Vex woman named Tella, but as a presence. A white-haired figure who walked the corridors and answered questions from children who had been born after the war. One day a child asked him, "Why did you do it? You were alone. You could have sold the ship and been rich." Cade looked out the observation window at a sky full of ships that carried the Iron Vow's design in their bones. He thought of gray dunes and ancient logs and a hum that had recognized him. "Because it was waiting," he said, "and I was too stubborn to walk away." The child didn't fully understand, but the child would remember. And that, Cade knew, was how shields were built, not from metal and fire, but from stories that refused to be forgotten. The Iron Vow orbited on, silent but never dead. And somewhere in its core, a tiny spark of Keleth programming registered the presence of a galaxy that had, against all calculation, learned to protect itself. It was, the ship decided, a good legacy. The galaxy's shield, built from one human who found a giant abandoned starship on a dead planet and refused to let the universe stay broken. And